Call it divine providence or call it a happy accident. This episode has had to be recorded a second time because our audio file was corrupted. And the first time that this episode was recorded was earlier today before we had gone out to see the headline drawing movie Sound of Freedom. And once again, we are reminded that there is evil in the world. And the subject and how that we're going to address that today is addressing evil and facing demoralization. Because I think that the success of this movie will be followed for some by a period of perhaps depression or some more accurately stated demoralization. And the goal of this episode is to once again return to meditations on evil and how we think about evil itself and what that demands of us or how we ought live. So, thank you for joining us today on the Redacted Culture Cast, a podcast that has been dedicated to the combination of philosophy, violence, and gun culture, as well as an ever-expanding arena into Americana and how we think about things. How do we think about things that are right and true and good? I'm going to put this out before so that I get it out of my head, but we launched a pre-order for the original T-shirts, which is a white logo or a white redacted on a black shirt. And then we also are launching hoodies in the middle of summer so that as the pre-order comes to fulfillment, oh, look at that, the light went out. As the pre-order comes to fulfillment, we will, it'll be doing so at the time when the evenings are getting cooler. So let me move around a little bit and see if I can't get this light. Nope, I can't get it to turn on. So I guess we're sitting in the dark together for those who are watching on YouTube. And for whatever platform you're listening on, thank you very much for spending the time to leave a comment or participate in the algorithm, to even share this show with people who you want to stimulate more not intrusive thoughts, but the kinds of conversations that I find I have with the people that I want to talk about or talk to. We, in gun culture, spend plenty of time talking about things like barrel length and kit setup and so forth, but I think the thing that really tends to move us is the why we do what we do and the how we want to see it done, not simply just the things. So we're back to meditations on evil, and the in our culture, at least here in the West, we are once again reminded of how secure so many of our lives have been, but also how that security is so fragile. It's invaded. It's not so simple, let's just say. And that when we try to hold on to these nice sounding ideas like there's no such thing as evil, only disagreements, I think we are sadly corrected, and hopefully not to as tragic of accounts as we have seen in a film of this sort. And I am thankful that, well, I guess I can say that I'm thankful that, in an extent, that the recording that was made before we saw the show was actually corrupted because of how, and not so much that my thoughts have changed on the matter, nor what we think to be true is altered, but rather it draws a deeper tone into what I expect to see going forward and what we as a culture and a gun community need to do about about putting our money where our mouth is. Or putting, and I don't even think phrasing it that way actually is the only way that we reach one another about what we actually believe. But let's start with some of the responses first, and some of the responses are interesting, not responses to this show, but in responses to the way that this story goes, because the central theme of the movie, maybe not the central theme, the story of the movie, if you haven't even gone out and seen it yet, and you have somehow avoided all of the people talking about it, is how human trafficking affects so many people's lives, and how there are stories of people who have tried to rescue those in the modern form of slavery. If you were to take the criticism of not the criticism leveled at the movie, but the criticism leveled in his book, the Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx, or the prohibitionists, the people who call themselves prohibitionists, who are anything but in our modern day, you might find that the complaints about reparations and slavery in most of what we'd consider American polite society is bourgeoisie at best. It is the vying for power and complaints of people who are not really faced with the kinds of evils that come as a result of the things they advocate for. The criticisms that get leveled at the movie range from the comical, that it is a white power fantasy, to the derogatory. Well, actually, that would be more derogatory. I think it'd be more derogatory to say that the actions of a man to try to rescue children in sexual slavery is a white power fantasy. I think that's a pretty dark. You have to be in a pretty dark place to believe that, to say it that way, to have that be your takeaway. And it also raises questions of that individual's moral compass. But moving on, some of the other criticism leveled at a film of this sort is that it is a conspiracy theory, that it doesn't exist, that the slave trade of this sort isn't real, that it's a right-wing fantasy, that it's a insert all these things that we can now really refer to as slurs. And while we may gain some entertainment from reading the absurdity of ridiculous people, we can't let it foreshadow it's not really the urgency isn't the right word, but the conviction that something of this matter brings up in us. The idea that this film, which is a film, it's a movie, it's a adaptation of a true story, is just ginning up public fervor from people of a certain ethical framework, doesn't even alone sufficiently produce the materials for an accurate criticism. Not an accurate criticism, a justified criticism. Because if people have a moral compass where this would be, or people have a moral code where something of this sort, the idea of the kind of human slavery, the abuse of children, could take place even under their watch, that's not really something that you criticize somebody for. That would be something that you would want to be reinforced and encouraged. That people concerned about the enslavement of people is something, even children, that it's strange that you would want to discourage people from being bothered by the idea that children were being used or exploited in these horrific ways. Even as I'm saying this, I'm recognizing that I'm going to be publishing this episode on platforms that may not be happy with the words that we almost have to use to talk about it. There's this idea, you can talk about extremes that or not even extremes, but certain components of these theories or these ideas or these arguments that may not hold up to scrutiny, but that doesn't mean that you throw out the baby with the bathwater. Just because a child is sold into slavery and used for picking coca leaves doesn't mean that he wasn't sold into slavery, when the accusation is that he's sold in a different format. And so it's an interesting framework. But I think the most foundational one for us that are concerned with philosophy, theology, which in my argument is the same thing anyway, is that there was one, and I can't remember who claimed it, but it was that the movie was classified as a religious thriller. Now, on the from a perhaps more diplomatic sense, I think that this might be an accusation thrown at the movie, in part because of who of the company that produced the movie. I think it was Angel Studios, and so they might say that it's a religious thriller because it was made by religious people. But when you consider what that means, what the idea of religion is, it doesn't really have the sting that it's supposed to have, because ultimately all movies are religious movies. All movies deal with some sort of morals. They deal with the actions of individuals. They deal with the things that we think about, we believe about, we fight for, we move for, we act for, we betray, we corrupt, we destroy. And so this idea of calling a movie, this specific movie, a religious thriller, it tells more about the accuser than it does about the movie itself. And it's that their idea of religion would be something that maybe a fourth grader would hold, or even a 4-year-old. Now, when me saying this I will admit that it is not really an original idea from me. I've read it, I've engaged with, or I've read it in books, and I've seen this kind of argument come up before, where the sort of secularism that claims that religion is a foolish belief in a sky daddy is criticizing a religion that is neither mature nor thorough in any way, shape, or form. And I think it's a great tragedy of our education system that we have and I'm talking about even on the collegiate level, that we've blinded ourselves completely to half of our perspective spectrum. And we've blinded ourselves by choosing that side of our person, of what we believe to be right or true or good, is purely arbitrary, that morals are like fashion statements to be exchanged in the day for whatever outcome is desired, which, under more scrutiny, would recognize that the only moral that person holds is whatever they want at that time. So the problem that we have, the problem with this description, that The Sound of Freedom is a religious thriller, is that it's true, but it's implying that other films that have morals, that argue for certain outcomes, that believe in something that is considered the good, are not. That the problem with calling this film a religious thriller is that it is using the term religion improperly, distorting it distorting its definition to turn it into a slur, into a derogatory phrase. And what ends up being the case is the intellect of the accuser should be called into question. Maybe not the intellect, but the integrity they're bringing to their intellectual argument. What is their character? Are they lying? Are they malicious? But once again, so if we're gonna, once again, or to return to this argument about religion, if we are going to separate the world between the is and the ought, and science science is the thing that we call whatever apparatus, whatever intellectual process we use to understand the physical world, that which exists, we recognize that apparatus does not have the components, does not have the mechanisms that are required to inform us of what the ought is. What I ought do, what is the right thing to do, what is good. Because I can say that selling a child into slavery causes trauma and changes their psyche. I can say that it injures their body and even injures their mind, which even trying to say it in that light just sounds so callous. It might even make one want to vomit. But what it doesn't inform you, no physical trauma can inform you that that is wrong. There is something else that tells you that it is wrong. And whatever that thing is religion, is in this sense your religion. Whatever, whether it is a organized religion in the form of Christianity, Islam, or even, let's just call it Buddhism, Hinduism, something that we've given a title to, something that's claimed a name. Spirituality, fine, I'll give you a pass that time. Or it's something that we don't recognize even in ourselves, like conscience, or I dare say compassion, because that's another trap. But so now we're here at a position, we're here in a state of recognizing there is that I am sitting in a chair, but there's something else that tells me that chair ought hold my body, hold my weight. We recognize that there is something called an that there is a global slave trade that preys on children. But it doesn't inform us that it ought not happen. And that's where it gets dicey. I think it isn't dicey, it isn't uncomfortable that we can come to the conclusion that it shouldn't happen, that it should be stopped, that it should be interrupted, that those guilty should be punished. But the question I think a person will eventually run into is, by what standard? And we'll call up things like human rights, the innocence of children. And as soon as we get to that, as soon as we are analyzing it on that layer, we will recognize that there is no moral argument, there is no moral framework that isn't itself functioning as a religion. But moving aside from the criticisms thrown at this movie, I think the movie itself highlights something within our culture, which is demoralization. And now you can cue in the Yuri Bezmenov story about how to conquer a country. You demoralize their population. We'll need to do the philosopher's job, or the philosophical process, or whatever we want to call it, that goes into what do we mean when we're talking about demoralization. One way, which I think is actually more uncommon, of referring to demoralization is that a person who is demoralized is incapable of determining that which is moral. And that might be a technical term used in a specific application, but the type of demoralization that I want to talk about today is that kind of demoralization that I think, in fact, I know that many of us deal with, and that is the kind of demoralization that comes about when I know there is something evil going on and that I want to do something about it, but I don't know what to do. I don't feel like I can do anything. That the idea of the human trafficking, the scale of human trafficking is so grand that what can somebody as small as I do in this environment, do about this thing? And before we go too far, I want to give one thing. One thing that you can do is not participate in it. But I don't believe that that is far enough. At least, though, we cannot participate in it. So, the demoralization that I'm talking about, the demoralization, when I refer to demoralization, I'm referring to a sense of hopelessness or incapability under moral terms, in a morally in a situation that demands a moral response. And that kind of demoralization is an interesting one to try to impose on a people. If we could break their will, if we could demoralize them to think that they can't do anything, there's nothing they can do to make it better, to change anything, then they will quit seeking after that which is good and only choose that which distracts them from their burning conscience. It's not uncommon to see people who feel like they cannot do the thing that they are supposed to do, seek after ways of distraction, whether it's alcohol or running away or I mean, gosh, you can go down that road a long way. But there are the actions that people take to try to turn their face away from their conscience, which is telling them that this is not right, and maybe they can do something about it. And if you can convince a population that it is impossible for them to act morally, whether it's because of their ethnicity or their station in life or their original sin of whiteness or whatever, or because they're just a citizen and they're not supposed to do those things, that being a part of their community and looking after their families and their friends and their parishioners and their coworkers, that having some sort of presence in their environment is actually privilege. If you can ruin them of that, discourage it, then maybe the outcome that you're getting is a demoralized population. And a demoralized population that doesn't believe that it can do what is right might stop trying to do what is right. So, demoralization in regards to this film is an interesting, is not just an interesting subject, but I think it's something to be aware of, is that there will likely, we are already experiencing, actually, a renewed fervor within the, let's call it cultural conversation over this evil that we call human trafficking. And for those who are listening and those who are talking about it, I warn you against using words like it's unimaginable how evil something like this is, or it's unthinkable, because somebody thought about doing it and somebody imagined ways to make it happen. And those people are people, and we are people. And that, I think, is the scary part, is that when we recognize that we have a capacity for evil, which is separate from a capacity for violence, we now know that there is something that we need to keep in check. But the demoralization that is sure to come from the after effects of this film is going to be that kind of demoralization which says, I can't do anything about it. And that's where I think we're wrong. I want to warn against that demoralization, because I think it's sure to come, if not in larger batches, at least in individuals who think, who are kept up at night at the horrors of what could be happening and wonder, what can I do? And there's an answer to this, and I want to be able to be clear on that answer. And the answer actually comes from the problem itself. One of the things that the movie does well is it highlights how decentralized this trade is. There isn't particularly a single bad guy, which I'm sorry if I'm spoiling the movie for you, but the movie does an excellent job identifying how decentralized this global slave trade is. There isn't an evil overlord. There is no real head to chop off to let the body of the snake die. There are so many different nodes and participants and buyers and sellers and kidnappers and transporters, and all of these things come together in that ugly way that makes it so much more difficult to deal with. And in that problem, we start to find a bit of the solution. And that solution, for those who have been listening to this channel, may sound a little bit aggrandizing, but that is that we continue to function, we continue to recognize and operate in our own decentralized country. That gun culture itself is a decentralized environment, that we are not all dependent on a centralized, let's just say, pillar, but rather we focus on, and part of what decentralization is focusing on what you have influence over, what you have authority over, instead of fretting over what that tower over there is doing all the time. There is time to be concerned about when people in power, even people in power in our country, are involved in such horrible activities. And there is a place to be concerned about it. And I believe that the solution to that is more than a single faction, or it has more than a single facet. There may be a justice element to it. Maybe you are called in this sense to go get involved, be a part of the justice system, to address the multiple heads of this hydra in the areas that you function. And maybe your job is to look after your church and the young people there. Those don't always have to be one and the same person. And this is even how we see gun culture come together, because I can look at somebody who works for an agency or a prestigious military unit who works hard in their environment to face down the evils that they can see, while recognizing that while I admire traits in them, I have my own responsibilities where I am at. I have my own family. I have my own community. Where in gun culture we can get over that weird, ever-returning drama between people of different backgrounds, and specifically training backgrounds even, and recognize that each of us is playing a different role in our different environments. That if you even want to get as simple, call it petty, as the mountain recce versus urban CQB drama, I mean, it's not really dramatic, it's more humorous at this point. Some people actually do live in the mountains, and some people do live in the cities, and it's up to us as individuals to choose with humility what it is that we focus on per our environment. But even further, it is to recognize that when we as a culture each take responsibility for our own areas of influence, then the whole culture has a foundation by which to stand on. The whole community has something that we can respect. And then from there we build, let's just call it micro-diplomatic methods of engaging with people of different communities or different cultures. Well, not completely different cultures, but there's a word there. Or different cities or different states, different nations, different countries, and so on and so forth. Is that we don't bother ourselves. We do not give undue attention to something that we know we have no control over, and instead place our focus on something that we do. And before that gets misconstrued, I will challenge a criticism that can get labeled at that, and that is, if we all sometimes the criticism might sound something like this, and I'm going to try to steelman it, but it is acknowledging it's difficult for me in this case, especially giving this presentation extemporaneously. The criticism might sound like, well, if everybody is only concerned with themselves, that gives a lot of freedom of movement for those who are, let's just say, building a bigger picture problem. Let's talk about it in elections. Is like, if we are only concerned with our local elections, what's to say that somebody wicked and malicious won't wield the power of the federal government to punish his political opponents? If we're only interested with what's in front of us, what are we, how is it going to be, how are we not going to be duped and fooled by somebody who is looking 10 steps ahead? And the answer is, I think you're correct. Just don't give it more weight over your daily life than it should. If you are kept up at night, if you are incapable of resting, if you're incapable of finding some good to do in your environment, look a little bit bigger. If you have, in that even Jordan Peterson sense, if you already have your act together in this arena, then add one layer out. I mean, that's kind of a loose paraphrase of something he said, but I don't know if I can say that in anything other than that seems a little bit more reasonable than fret about things that I can't do while letting my house fall to ruin. So, in a bit of a summary, let's kind of re-summarize real quickly. We in a bit of a summary, let's address it. We had the criticisms at the beginning, but the concern that we have, that the concern that's presented, the thought that's the problem that's going to be, that we are almost certainly to face from seeing a movie of this capacity, is that we will feel like we are simultaneously met with a call to action and have no idea where to go, or feel like we are incapable of dealing with it. And the answer is you are. We are, as individuals, as communities, as states, as nations, capable of addressing these problems, but we must do it voluntarily, or we must choose to do so with courage. It's another way I'm going to say. I think I can say those two things are essentially pointing at the same thing in this context, and and that might be locally, and that might be beyond that. That might be in your physical surroundings, but that might be beyond it as well. It might be in, maybe your community is also decentralized in that way, where they are not all in the same area. I wish I had an easy answer. I wish I had something that I could just present and say, yeah, here's how we do it. We build some super secret task force that goes and does vigilante things or whatever. But there are moral pitfalls in that, and there are dangerous things to be said. I recognize the difficulty of that. And I also recognize, if you want to hear about the call to adventure, read Hero with 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell. by my opinion. The majority of the book is great. The last 3 or 4 pages is kind of, well, I when I read it for the first time, I didn't really get much from those. But don't lose the weight and value of the book just because you got a couple pages that are a little, in my opinion, not even just in my opinion. It goes from a substantial argument to sort of an unsubstantial one. But or almost even a self-negating one, interestingly enough. But the argument, the point being said is, maybe this is what we are doing right now, is that maybe this is where you are at right now, is where you are hearing that call to adventure. Maybe that is what this movie does, or a video game does, or a book does, or a story does, or hearing a tale or reading a thing, a historical account, is that call to adventure. And remember that call to, just to be clear, that call to adventure is the call to action. And if you really believe that you are being called to action, here's a warning. It will demand more of you than you think you are willing to give. It will make demands of you in ways that you're unexpecting because you don't know what's on the other side of the veil. When it comes to the great evil that is human trafficking, we will have to face things as individuals, as communities, and as a country in order to solve it. And it's not going to be able to be solved universally. It will never go away completely. You cannot produce perfect morality in people, nor is that dystopian hellscape, which is compliance, sufficient to be considered morality. But instead, every generation and every person, every family, every community will be faced time and time again, year after year after year, to do what is right in their environment. And if they let it go to hell, then they deserve the hell that they chose. And some of those victims will be children who did not choose to be there. When you give up on the possibility of morality in your community, when you let it go to when you let the rule of morality and the rule of such things fall to people who abuse it, the victims are not always people who participated in that process. So that's where our duty lies. The idea of a watcher on the wall, or a man looking out into the future, looking for danger on the horizon. A sentinel is a little bit different, but we have these terms. The watcher on the wall. Let's just use that example. It's an interesting metaphor because we don't have walls anymore. Not in the same way. Maybe we're too busy looking for demons to come falling out of the sky, and we have failed to see the small evils that have led to this massive decentralized network, this massive decentralized predatory environment, this whatever you want to call it, because we're looking out for the apocalypse to come happen, that we have failed to see the monsters in our midst, because we have been fretting about things outside of our control, or things that we could have control over but have chosen to abdicate that capability. We have allowed those within us, we have allowed the evil within our own hearts to fester into the kinds of horrors that stomach turning isn't sufficient to define. So when you're faced with demoralization, which will come, maybe small for some, larger for others, I want to leave you with this encouragement. This is not the first time we have faced evil or the first time we've been made aware of it, nor will it be the last. And if you're looking for some change to come swinging out of the sky and overnight you'll become the hero of a story, you're setting yourself up for failure. Instead, day by day by day, we struggle uphill, tripping as we do, choosing to chase after what is right day after day after day. We may watch stories like this, we might watch stories like this film and say, man, I wish I could have a story like that. And I don't know if a story like this would matter if everyone had one. Would it? Probably not. But that does not leave each of us as individuals incapable of action within our own lives, within our own world. Maybe it's important to know what's going on in your town. Maybe it would be useful to change the way that you approach certain scenarios. Maybe it would be important to look out for things that are going on in your environment, paying attention to the ways that human trafficking preys on people. A good example of this is that in the sleepy town of Minneapolis, in the state of Minnesota that no one really knew about until 2020, there is a huge, well, that's not even a good descriptor. It's one of the most popular states for human trafficking. I guess that's not the right way of saying it. It has a huge cases of it, whether it's in indigenous populations, novelty, highways, modes of transit. We've got water and highway. Adjacent countries or bodies of water like the Great Lakes that can be, or even the Mississippi that, in theory, a barge could reach the ocean, and then there you go. But also, it's who we are, who we interact with, and how we think about justice. And how we participate in our communities, and what we live for, and what we chase after, and what we pursue. Don't get lost standing on a wall, watching for the apocalypse, and miss the giant network, that amalgamous beast beneath your own feet. Thank you for listening. This is certainly a difficult topic as we're talking about evil, meditations on evil. This one is even more specific. And thank you for being a part. So go forth and conquer. This has been the Redacted Culture Cast. We'll talk to you soon.